Mysteries in the West. 5. The Secret Doctrine. I asked a child, walking with a candle, "From where comes that light?" Instantly he blew it out. "Tell me where it is gone. Then I will tell you where it came from." Hassan of Basra. Whether nominally of the East or West, we are all heirs in one way or another to the strengths and weaknesses of the medieval Arab philosophy. One of the drawbacks of this method was the attempt to apply its working outside its most successful field. This field was, of course, the collection, comparison, authentication, and explanation of the traditions of the Prophet. The adoption of this technique and its traditions, itself an expansion of scholarly methods derived by the Saracens from the Christian Greek theologians, was rapid. It could easily be learnt, because it meant collecting facts and piling them one upon the other, with a view to form something complete. There was another factor which existed side by side with this system in the Saracen lands. It was the formulation of schools of study and practice of a special kind, in which the teacher, the teaching, and the taught formed, in at least one sense, a unity. This part of the method was not transmitted unaltered, because it did not lend itself to institutionalization, the format which was developing most rapidly in the West. Even before the Moors were expelled from Spain, it was mainly their books which were translated, and this single-line knowledge was accepted, together with material which had already filtered through from earlier Eastern Mediterranean sources. The can of pineapples was imported and recipes concocted based on canned pineapple. The growing and packaging of the pineapple was something else, which in most quarters received little attention, says a modern Sufi on this theme. Because the personal element of a teacher with special attainment militated against the needs of a continuing organization, this concept was dropped. It lingered uneasily among the independent people who were termed occultists and preached a doctrine dangerous to institutionalism, the unacceptable one of the need for a completely qualified teacher, one who knew things which were not in books. After the fall of Constantinople, Greek original material, again in the form of books, provided more single-line material, more cases of pineapples. The institution of discipleship, tied to the concept of maintaining the monastic or academic institution, regarded advanced products in the form of personalities of greatness with wonder and admiration. The object of the institution was not to produce such people. They occurred in spite of, not because of, it. They were labelled saints. This was the function of religious organization. The intellectual movement, on the other hand, specialized in producing more intellectuals and more enlightenment through the use of the human brain, employed more or less as we would today use a machine, but regarded as almost a form of sanctified performance, mainly because of its comparative novelty. The Saracens themselves were not guiltless of transmitting the purely intellectual approach, though this was with them generally considered to be a phase rather than a dedication. Strong traces of the various kinds of thinking and reaction are still strongly with us. There is the devout scholastic, the pious ecclesiastic, the pure pedant. Then there is the man who dislikes organization so much that he overreacts against it, harking back to the unlettered seer of antiquity in the belief that the whole of human greatness is the result of inspiration. The psychological and other new sciences follow close behind, pointing out the inadequacies of all the rest. In many cases, this has already become a monotony referable to arguing from a new fixed idea and partaking of the nature of religious dogmatism and all the rest. Even in formalized Arab, which often meant Greek, philosophy, there were often saving graces, strains of inner teaching or emphasis which were ignored in their adoption by the Western scholastics of the university type. In the East, the tradition of a master and his disciples continued, in spite of the overlay of sheer scholasticism. It is acknowledged that the intellectual movement initiated by Ibn Rushd in the 12th century continued to be a living factor in European thought until the birth of modern experimental science. Professor Philip Hitti, History of the Arabs, page 584. From the 8th century, the Arabs had been studying and adapting Greek thought to their own ideas. Like the later Westerners, most of them worked from books alone, on the assumption that a book can contain the sum total of a teaching. Ibn Rushd asserted the thinker's right to submit everything, except supernaturalism, to the force of reason. He was a doctor, a commentator on Aristotle, and an astronomer. He also studied music, a monograph upon which was published in his famous Aristotelian commentary, and which was taught at Paris after being expurgated by the Church. This Cordoban was known to the West as Averroes, and he exercised a tremendous effect upon Jewish thinkers. Like his master Ibn Tufayl, he is said to have passed down a Sufic system alongside the permitted philosophical one. Ibn Tufayl, known to the West as Abu Baisa, after his first name Abu Bakr, was also a physician, philosopher, and ultimately vizier at the court of Granada. He wrote the extraordinary romance called The Story of Hay ibn Yaqsan. This, in the opinion of Western students, is the prototype of Robinson Crusoe, Alexander Selkirk merely serving as the news peg to provide topicality. It is based upon a story by Avicenna the Bukharan, 980 to 1037, whose teaching was almost entirely philosophical. He, too, was a physician, philosopher, and scientist. Avicenna followed yet another giant philosopher, Alpharabius, whose Sufic ideas have been labelled Neoplatonic. He died over 1,000 years ago. All these names form a vital part of the modern heritage of thought. The reaction against medieval attempts to form a coherent idea of life and creation has, in the opinion of many, not served us very much better than credulity. The questing mind of the scientist, full of the desire for discovery, has been recognized in more recent times as overreaching itself. The scientist who has to keep his mind and concentration fixed upon an ever-narrowing field of study is in danger, and nowadays he admits it. He can become too concentrated or too diffused. His intellectual development is sometimes won at a sacrifice of emotional adjustment. This danger has long been apparent to those Sufis who are interested in scientific work. One of them, Anwar Faris, says, "The twin exercises of identification and detachment are valuable in the training of the self. Too much identification produces an atrophy of the faculty of detachment. Fanaticism is the frequent result. A man becomes attached to something and cannot escape." When the sage Ibn Sina, Avicenna, was writing his work on minerals, he used to study the mineral world, in general and in particular. He concentrated upon individual examples, then detached from this and absorbed himself in the whole. Thus did he strike a balance, together with concentration and detachment in other fields of thought and essence. The superficial remedy to this is expressed in the complete man, which the Moors considered to be a reflection of the inner complete man. Joseph McCabe, The Splendour of Moorish Spain, London 1935, refers to the outer appearance of the cultivated man in his Spanish setting. All but a few literary cranks now see that the main line of human progress is in the extension of the scientific spirit to the whole of life. But it must be kept carefully in mind that this is only half of the Arab ideal of life. To most of their thinkers, it would have seemed meaningless to ask if science were not in some danger of making men hard, calculating, over-intellectual, cold, insensitive to beauty and art. Their students of science were quite commonly poets and musicians. That there was any antagonism between the intellectual and emotional life, that both could not be cultivated by the same person, would have seemed to them a paradox. This way of life, still less than the Sufic one, was not widely adopted by the newly emergent West. In the Renaissance, the cultural ideal was attempted, but not the one within that, the thesis of internal change, balance, extension of perception. The arts, studies, and theories were adopted piecemeal and studied or reproduced, even developed. The inner sense was lost, lingering in places to be derided by the victorious sheer scholasticism and pure art worship. The materials were studied and handed on in fragments as philosophy, astronomy, medicine. Many developing schools of learning in Northern Europe, under severe ecclesiastical pressure or control, found it necessary to expurgate from this material non-Christian sentiments. This further limited the vitality of the material. From Sicily, through the German baptized sultans of the Hohenstaufen strain, Northern Europe received a form of this knowledge, but it was undoubtedly processed in a similar way. And this notwithstanding the adoption of Sufi architecture for the great Hohenstaufen castle, nor the Sufi symbolism of the coronation mantle of King Roger I. It is almost not too much to say that those who persisted in thinking sophistically were soon branded occultists. Their followers accepted the label. The result was a distorted, rather pathetic belief in mastership, illumination, and the personal triumph through occultism. Roger Bacon cites The Secrets of Illuministic Wisdom, a Sufi book by Ibn Sabin, who was in correspondence with Frederick II von Hohenstaufen. Hitty, page 587 and 610. Bacon's fate was to be considered as an occultist, not because of his preaching as officially accepted, but because of his having impressed the living transmission theory upon those who disliked dogmatism and were therefore themselves cast into the scholastic wilderness. Nowadays their spiritual heirs accept the occultist label and wander still, like the Indian untouchables who actually refer to themselves as outcasts. The West, which mostly meant the Church, had taken what it thought it needed and slammed the door with what seemed finality. Books were burned, Spain reclaimed for the true faith. At the other side of the threshold were left a strange assortment of people, things, and ideas. Among them was material for future puzzlement, not strange to a Sufi: the troubadours, the game of cards, the harlequin, certain initiatory societies. There were cracks in the door, which let something, but very little, in and out. At the end of the 18th century, Napoleon invaded Egypt. A general with his forces founded the Order of the Seekers of Wisdom, otherwise known as the Sophian, the Sufis. In a book perhaps correctly titled The Mélange, he explained how he located among the Eastern adepts the sources of the orphan secret wisdom of the West. This was the fount we had been for centuries following the wide but muddied river. Why and by what process the river had repeatedly become muddied in the West seems to have been eventually understood by the Sophian, who in microcosm repeated the fate of their predecessors, though through no fault of their own. They had assumed that all they needed to import into the West was the doctrine and the methodology, without the teacher. Only 6 years after the reputed date of starting the order, the affirmation of the Sophians of France admitted failure. We must dissolve rather than continue repetitiously to practice rituals and operations which, in the absence of the active teaching master, cannot produce the essential man. The process is of a complexity which only superior perceptions of needs will meet. The secret which the master has, this he uses to cause and make grow the change in others, who shall take his place. Without him the community cannot really progress, though it may retain its outward form. But Sufi masters cannot be recruited or imported. The notice of dissolution continues piteously. Who can force to himself the presence of the living illuminate? He knows the needs, and he fulfills them. For us there is only yearning. At least the Sophians had learnt something. Fragments seem to have lingered on, because many years later an offshoot was reported to be persisting in India. Was the door slammed for good? It seemed so. Not only did the West have enough science, art, and other materials to digest, but it had the weapon of propaganda. The geopolitical struggle so well delineated by Professor Toynbee, coupled by the Crusades mentality, proceeded to stigmatize everything Saracen, Paynim, or Arab as not only heretical, infidel, and unpleasant, but diabolical and dangerous. A.J. Toynbee, A Study of History, Volume 8, Heroic Ages, Contacts Between Civilizations in Space, Oxford, 1956, pages 216 and following, The Encirclement of the Islamic World by the West, Russia, and Tibet. The West inherits this tradition, steadily reinforced by events. First it was the Spanish Arabs who had to be beaten back from the borders of France. Then the infidel who was holding the Holy Land. Then the Turks were preparing to storm the gates of Vienna. Mohammedanism lumped together in the Western mind constituted a threat and an evil which must be contained and counterattacked. The last phase was ably sustained by the missionary interests which intended to overcome Islam for the greater glory of the Church. The existence of the Turkish Empire only proved that the infidel foe was still a threat. Little was to be learnt in any case from people who were, in many cases, now members of dependent communities, whether the sun set on them or not. Only cranks interested themselves in Eastern philosophy. Cranks were to be found in every community. Was one to turn Turk or go native? Unhygienic people who did not even accept the gospel, and whom one ruled, were hardly likely to be able to teach anything. Let them, in any case, put their own house in order first. And yet there were people who looked beyond this temporary view of human development, even though they would never have believed that the circumstances in which they found themselves were as temporary as we now know them to be. And the process started earlier than one would believe. The Sufic current was at work. We must go back several hundred years to Majorca to find a trace of the double life which was being led by mystics at that time, Christian anchorites doubling as Sufi teachers. Brother Anselm of Tomeda was a Majorcan mystic of the Dark Ages and saint to the Christians. But this was very far from being all. Among the Muslim Spaniards, he was the sanctified Sufi Abdullah al-Tarjuman. What did he teach? His book, Dispute of the Ass with Brother Anselmo, is a sometimes literal translation of a part of the Encyclopedia of the Arab Brethren of Purity. Since his Arabic name literally means servant of God, the translator, there is no reason why he should not have tried, by translation, to pass on Sufi teachings. A modern Spanish scholar, Ángel González Palencia, in Hispania, Book 18, Chapter 3, October 1935, draws attention to him and calls him El Estupendo Plagiario. But in the Middle Ages, learning was not always considered to be the property of individuals, especially the knowledge published by a secret society, a band of anonymous sages like the Brethren. Copyright was unknown. This living link between Arab teaching and Christianity is carried on by another strange character, a renegade priest. In 1782, Father Juan Andres, an expelled Jesuit, published a remarkable book, Origen, Progresos y Estado Actual de toda la Literatura. He tried to show the debt of Europe to Spanish-Arabian learning. He pointed to the diffusion of science, even recognized the debt of St. Thomas to this source. Spanish poetry, he noted, sprang from the Arabic development in Spain, including the Provençal and troubadour romances and Italian lyric verse, as well as the development of the novel, fables, and the music of the Arabic-speaking Alfonso the Sage. How did the renegade Jesuit know all these things? There was no documentation at the time available to him. And yet, in some so far unexplained manner, he discovered facts about the Arab, and particularly Sufic, heritage of the West, which was later to be pieced together almost point by point, largely through a study of the documents of Arab Spain. Even the probable origins of the Jesuit system in the Fatimite schools of Egypt can hardly account for the perception which ex-Father Andres showed, because this was not a Sufi school. The correspondences are listed in Amirs Ali's authoritative Short History of the Saracens. Was there a current of hidden teaching, a vein of ancient lore, which the expelled Jesuit had tapped? There was indeed. The Eastern impact in the Dark Ages was absorbed on several levels. Of these, the most important are the theological and the occultist. Lully, Assisi, Scott, and dozens of others passed on the theological version. But we only have to glance at the list of the famous names of occult Illuminati of Europe to see what was the nature of the secret doctrine which they were passing down, in however garbled a form. Raymond Lully, according to the occultists, was an alchemist and illuminate. According to the devout, he was a Christian missionary. According to his own writings, he was an adapter of Sufi books and exercises. Roger Bacon, another hierophant of occultism, wrote on Sufi illuminism. Paracelsus, who tried to reform Western medicine, presents Sufi ideas. He, too, is one of the heroes of the magicians and alchemists. Jaber the alchemist was one of the best-known Sufis of Iraq. He is known as a master of occultism. Also in the occult tradition is Albertus Magnus, both scholastic and magician, who studied in Arab schools and inspired St. Thomas Aquinas. Numerous popes, supposed to be magicians or transmitters of a secret doctrine, the hidden teaching, were graduates of Arab schools, such as Gerbert, Pope Sylvester II. Lawrence, Archbishop of Malfi, is charged with having learnt his secret law from Sylvester, and so the process continues. In organizations, it is the same story. If the Franciscan order bears the stamp of Sufi origins, so do the Rosicrucians and the Masons. The terminology of contemporary witches in England contains, as unknown words, ordinary untranslated Arabic phrases. The salutation, "Blessed be," is the least significant, but provides an instance of a direct rendering of the Sufi salutation, Mabaruk Bashad, the calling down of the baraka upon an individual or assembly. The secret teaching, in most of its expressions accessible to us, therefore, boils down to very little other than simplicity for whoever has the patience or the general knowledge of what was on which side of the door when it was banged, all those centuries ago. There are times in the lives of all scholars when, with all the drama and excitement of discovery, the thrill of realization bursts upon them. It may be the result of a tiny thought working in the mind, patiently collecting unaccounted scraps of information, bursting forth into blinding light. Inventors, scientists, historians, all have known this experience. Miguel Asín y Palacios, the renowned Spanish Arabist, devout Christian though he was, knew this thrill when he came across the work of the Illuminist school of Sufi philosophers, and realized what they had given to the world, even the highest reaches of the Catholic world. It was in the 9th century that Ibn Masara of Córdoba taught to a select group of disciples what he knew of the heights to which the human consciousness could attain. From these beginnings, the Illuminists were to provide the substance of the allegories of Dante, the teachings of the school known as the Augustinian Scholastics of the Middle Ages, the wisdom of some of the founders of modern Western philosophy, Duns Scotus and Roger Bacon from Britain, Raymond Lully of Majorca, St. John of the Cross among the canonized. Solomon ibn Gabirol, a Jewish thinker of Malaga, based his Fount of Life on Masara's work. This, in turn, inspired the Franciscan school. Hitti, History of the Arabs, page 580 and following. As he delved more and more deeply into the rare manuscripts which had lain almost untouched in Spain since the expulsion of the Moors, Professor Asín's excitement mounted. There, in the sometimes crabbed, strange Maghribi script of the Sufi Spaniards of a millennium ago, was not only the idea of the Illuministic philosophy, but in many cases he found literal quotations cited in the works of mystics and philosophers whose names were household words to the devout of Europe. Asín was not alone in this discovery, however, for Professor Ribera had noted such facts as the statement by the great Majorcan mystic Lully that he had written his masterwork, Book of the Lover and the Beloved, on the pattern of the Sufis. This is all the more remarkable because the Sufi Illuminists are among the most famous and yet the most secretive of all Sufi schools. Such intellectual giants as Suhrawardi, Ibn al-Arabi of Murcia, and al-Ghazali rigidly adhered in their public writings to non-communication of the vital data which was to bring about the actual transformation of the human mind and complete the alchemy of happiness, as Ghazali called it. The strange seeming contradiction that Gnosticism and agnosticism actually meet somewhere along the Sufi path baffled the externalists who sought to penetrate the experiences of the schools. It still baffles some people. And yet there is evidence that at the deepest levels of Sufic secrecy, there is a mutual communication with the mystics of the Christian West. And the influence of the Illuminist philosophy profoundly affected the East as well. The Persian, Turk, Afghan mystics all followed the Illuminists. Archon Darul, in A History of Secret Societies, New York, 1962, has shown that the process of Illuminism as the host to a secret within a secret extends until the present day. The Illuminati of England, France, and Germany, organized as a secret society, the Alumbrados of Spain, and numerous other initiatory circles, continue to transmit the teachings of these Spanish scholars. Before turning to a consideration as to what Illuminism is, it will be as well to note what its followers had to say about its origins. Here again we come across the secret doctrine theory in its full development. The secret book, Wisdom of Illumination, states that the philosophy is identical with the inner teachings of all the ancients, the Greeks, the Persians, the Egyptians, and is the science of light and the deepest truth, through whose exercise man can attain to a status about which he can normally only dream. Roger Bacon repeated this assertion, and from him the idea was taken up all over Europe, giving rise to numerous secret schools, some of them genuine, others entirely bogus. This knowledge, said Bacon, was known to Noah and Abraham, to the Chaldean and Egyptian masters, to Zoroaster and Hermes and Greeks such as Pythagoras, Anaxagoras and Socrates, and to the Sufis. Suhrawardi, who wrote his secret book a century before Bacon, and was judicially murdered for it, is quoted by Bacon himself, or rather his book is, as Baron Cara de Vaux has shown, in the journal Asiatique, 19, page 63. Among the strange byways of history, we may note Bacon named as a Rosicrucian, a follower of the path of the Rose Cross, a late mistranslation of the Sufi phrase, path of the rose. It was inevitable that religious zealots and others should counterattack the Western scholars who unearthed the Sufi teachings as being the basis of work which had been for centuries admired and applauded by the most orthodox Christians. Hence we find As-Sin replying, Obras Escogidas, 1 Madrid 1946, with all the emphasis at his disposal. Recently publishing a doctoral thesis, Character and Origins of the Ideas of the Blessed Raymond Lulle, Toulouse 1912, its author, Mr. Probst, with completely infantile audacity, calls Menendez y Pelayo, Ribera and me liars and romantics for maintaining the Arab affiliation of the Lullian system. This inexpert youth does not know my study, Psychology according to Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, published in the Acte du 40e Congrès des Orientalistes 7 years ago, in which I had demonstrated documentarily the copying of the allegory of the lights. Even in those days, before his studies of the illuminism of the Sufis were complete, As-Sin was ready and willing to produce documents to prove his point. In the work of men like As-Sin, the pendulum is swinging back, and the Sufi influence is being recognized. But the discovery that Christian contemplatives use Sufi books, Sufi methods, Sufi terminology, has stimulated the inevitable results, expressed in the explanations which are now pouring out from the cells of the modern scholastics. Sufism, it is now declared, is able to produce true mystical experience because the Sufis revere Jesus. Further, Sufism was profoundly influenced in its early days by Christianity. The implication is that Sufic ideas are not to be rejected. If St. John of the Cross and Lully could use them, there must be some good in them. The scholastics have retraced a part of their path and are rewriting their history to allow for uncomfortable facts. The only danger in this activity is that, as new material comes to light, new reshaping of the official attitude becomes necessary. Mental gymnastics. Those who do not adhere so strongly to the theological line are busy tracing Sufism back to coincidences in ancient doctrines. Contact with Sufis, who were discovered not to be ogres after all, provoked another interesting development in Western thought, a process which is still continuing. This development can best be termed recognition. A realization of the affinity of Sufic thought with Western intuition and ideas has brought many people to the point where they are taking a close look at the system. By Sufic thinking, this comes about for two reasons. Firstly, because the bases of Sufi ways are inherent in the human mind, there is only one right way, and again because in modern Western training of all kinds are the scattered seeds of the ideas of the Sufi transmitters from Spain, Sicily, and elsewhere. The Sufic sentiments of Khayyam and others, which have almost become naturalized into the West, are another source of the diffusion of this current. We have various aspects of this diffusion in this book, chosen in order to illustrate it, not as any complete enunciation. The teachings of a continued vein of secret teaching, of which the books of philosophers were merely a part without the key, the arguments without the action, were transmitted to the West from the Illuminist Sufis of Spain and possibly the Near East as well. One channel is known to us. From Andalusia, the dissemination of this idea has been traced by Essene and his associates to Roger Bacon and Raymond Lully. Others have followed the trail in the work of Alexander Hales and Duns Scotus, and have noted the determining influence upon the so-called Augustinian scholastics of the West. The traditional account of how the teachings are transmitted and from where is partly contained in the Wisdom of Illumination, written by the martyr Suhrawardi. He lived from 1154 to 1191, an Easterner domiciled in Aleppo, and was killed by the Order of the Orthodox, whose pressure Saladin's nephew, the local ruler, was unable to resist. Thus he is known as Suhrawardi the Murdered. He is one of the greatest Sufi teachers, and his school, as Essene has demonstrated, provided Dante with his ideas. The murdered sheikh did not originate the Illuministic theory of Sufism, nor the tradition of a chain of masters from the remotest antiquity. But in the preface of his book, we have a sketch of his teachings on this point. Most copies were committed to the flames, but some have survived, especially in the East. As with most Sufi books, this was written in response to repeated requests, as he observes, written for his friends and companions. Philosophy has always existed, and there has always been a true philosopher in the world. The differences between the ancients and moderns is one of proof and demonstration. Aristotle was a great teacher, but dependent upon his forerunners. Among these were Hermes, Aesculapius, and others in very long succession. They may be divided into classes, some more elevated than others, according to the balance between intellection, speculation, belief, and so on. The importance of the philosopher is so great that if a fully balanced one is found, he is the representative of God on earth. But the inner philosopher is always superior to the scholastic. There is never an age in which a great theosopher is not in existence. The speculative philosopher has no right or claim to rulership. This rulership may not be political power, but if wisdom and power of a material sort are combined, the age is illuminated. Yet the philosopher may, because of his endowments, remain unknown, and yet have the mastery of the world. It is best for the philosopher to combine insight with experience, rather than one or the other. Nobody can benefit from a study of Sufism unless he has freed himself from the mental habits of formal philosophy. Such an undeveloped person should only frequent ordinary philosophers. In Sufism, certain perceptions have to be developed, and further development depends upon these. This is the equivalent of the scholastic method, in which the experiences are formed and ideas built of ideas. Unless this method of the Sufis is followed, the practitioner cannot be considered a real philosopher. The ancient doctrines of Egypt and Greece are in direct line with Sufism, and with them, of course, exposition had to take its place and relationship to experience, which means the development of the Sufi perceptions. The terminology of the Illuminists indicates that the theory embraces the ancient wisdom of the Semites as well as that of the Persians, hence showing the theme of the essential unity of complete philosophy at the theory and practice level. In formal scholasticism, of course, the division between intellect and inspiration is so great that it is difficult at first for the uninformed reader to grasp that these two things are considered by this school to be inseparable if the truth is to be reached. Hence the Sufi insistence that this step of cognition must be made.